Let me tell you a story about how I learned my true worth in the most unexpected way. I was sitting at the dinner table in my parents' grand dining room, a place I had rarely been invited to over the years. Danielle, my wife, sat beside me, her fingers resting lightly on my knee, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this across from us. My parents smiled in that way they always did, polite, distant, as if they were hosting business associates instead of their own son. My sister, Emma, was absent, which wasn't surprising. She was probably off somewhere enjoying the lavish wedding she had been planning for months. The meal had been pleasant enough, though stiff. My parents never knew how to hold a conversation with me. They asked about my job, my house, and then quickly pivoted to talking about their upcoming vacation to Europe. It was the same dance we had been doing for years, one where I was present, but not really acknowledged. And then, just as dessert was served, my father cleared his throat. "We need to talk about something important," he said, his voice carrying that tone of authority he had always used in business meetings, the same tone he used when he was about to make a demand. I leaned back in my chair, sensing something was coming. "What is it?" My mother exchanged a glance with my father before giving me one of her carefully curated smiles. "We've run into a bit of financial trouble. The company is facing some unexpected legal fees, and we had already promised Emma a grand wedding. You know how important appearances are in our social circle. Unfortunately, we're stretched thin, and you want me to pay for her wedding," I finished for her, my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. They didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. My father simply nodded. "You're doing well for yourself. It's not as if the money would be a burden on you." Danielle stiffened beside me, her hand tightening over mine. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay composed. After years of being overlooked, of being treated as second best to Emma, they still had the audacity to come to me, not out of love, not to mend our fractured relationship, but because they needed something. I took a slow breath and then did something that surprised even me. "I'll do it," I said. My parents' expressions flickered with something close to triumph, but I wasn't finished. "But I have two conditions," I continued, leaning forward. "First, I get to handle all the wedding arrangements, every single detail. Second, I want to give a speech at the wedding." They looked confused for a moment, but I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. They were desperate, and they knew they had no leverage over me. They nodded. "As long as the wedding goes smoothly, we don't care how you handle it," my father said. "Perfect," I replied, smiling in a way that made Danielle squeeze my hand again, probably in warning. They had no idea what was coming. When the wedding day arrived, everything was exactly how I had planned it. Emma had no say in any of the decisions, something I knew infuriated her. She had dreamed of a wedding that rivaled mine, but instead she was given something that, while beautiful, was far from the spectacle she had envisioned. I had made sure of it. Everything was elegant but subdued, nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed golden child's perfect wedding. Emma's frustration was clear in the way she barely spoke to me the entire day, and my parents seemed equally displeased but unwilling to voice their concerns, knowing that without me, this wedding wouldn't have happened at all. But it was during the reception, when I finally stepped up to give my speech, that I truly took control. I stood at the podium, scanning the crowd of family and acquaintances, my parents watching me with forced smiles. I took a deep breath and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a moment to thank my parents for giving me this opportunity to speak today," I said, pausing just enough to see their faces shift slightly. They hadn't expected this. "You see, for years my parents have given me very little," I continued, my voice steady. "They gave me a house to live in, food to eat, and an education, things that any parent should provide. But love, support, recognition, those were reserved for Emma." The room went silent. I spent my entire childhood watching my parents pour their attention, their affection, their resources into my sister while I was treated as an afterthought. And I accepted it. I worked hard, built my own life, thinking that maybe, just maybe, one day, they would see me as something more than just the son they had to provide for. But that never happened. I glanced at my parents, whose expressions had frozen into polite horror. Emma, sitting at the front, looked as if she wanted to disappear. But I'm not bitter, I continued. In fact, I'm grateful. Because without their neglect, I wouldn't have learned how to stand on my own. I wouldn't have learned the value of self-respect, of earning everything I have through my own efforts. And I certainly wouldn't have had the pleasure of standing here today at a wedding that I funded, giving this speech. I turned to Emma then, my expression softening. Emma, despite everything, I truly wish you happiness. I hope your marriage brings you the love and support that I never had. And I hope that one day you realize that happiness doesn't come from being the favorite. It comes from knowing who you are, beyond what people expect of you. With that, I stepped away from the podium, leaving behind a stunned silence. I didn't stay to see the aftermath. Danielle and I left shortly after, walking out into the warm night air. She looked at me, her expression unreadable before finally speaking. "Are you okay?" she asked. I let out a slow breath. For the first time in a long time, I said, "Yeah, I think I am." Later that night, Emma knocked on my hotel room door. She was crying. "I didn't know," she whispered. I thought you didn't care about us. About me. I thought you kept your distance because you wanted to." I sighed, feeling a weight in my chest I hadn't expected. "I didn't keep my distance, Emma. I was pushed away." She nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I see it now. I'm sorry." It was the first time I had ever heard those words from anyone in my family. A week later, my mother called. She told me that Emma had stopped speaking to my father, that he was furious at me for what I had done. But my mother, she sounded different, regretful. "He won't admit he was wrong," she said, "but I think he knows." For the first time, I had forced them to see me, to hear me. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my parents. Maybe this was the start of something new, or maybe it was the end. Either way, I had no regrets. For the first time in my life, I had spoken my truth, and they had no choice but to listen. Over the next few weeks, the dust from my speech settled, but the impact lingered. Emma and I continued talking, something we had never really done before. For the first time, she wasn't just my sister in name, but an actual person in my life. She confided in me about things she had never told anyone, how our parents had made her feel like she was constantly failing, even as they propped her up as their golden child. How she had resented the way they compared her to me, yet never allowed her to carve out her own identity. "I was never allowed to fail, you know," she said one night over the phone. "Every time I messed up, they covered for me. They never let me learn. And then I saw you out there on your own, doing everything without them. And it just made me feel like I was the defective one." I had never considered it from her perspective before. I had spent so much time resenting her, assuming she had the perfect life, when in reality she had been trapped just as much as I had, just in a different way. "Emma," I said, "you're not defective. You were just never given the chance to figure out who you are outside of them." She sniffled, then laughed bitterly. "Yeah, well, now I have that chance, don't I?" Our father still refused to speak to me. According to my mother, he was furious, not just about my speech, but about the fact that Emma had turned against him. She wasn't cutting him off completely, but she was setting boundaries for the first time in her life. She told him that she wouldn't work for the company anymore, that she needed to figure out her own career path, and that she wasn't going to be their little doll anymore. He called her ungrateful. He told her she was throwing away the life he had built for her, but she didn't back down. Meanwhile, my mother's calls became more frequent. She never outright apologized for the way she had treated me, but there was something different in her voice now, a hesitation, an uncertainty. As if for the first time, she was actually seeing me, not just as the son she had neglected, but as a person in my own right. "Your father won't change," she said one evening. "He's too proud." "I know," I replied, "but She hesitated. "I don't want to lose both of my children." There was a part of me that wanted to lash out, to remind her that she had been complicit in all of this, but I didn't. Because despite everything, despite all the years of neglect and favoritism, she was finally making an effort, and maybe that was enough. "Then don't," I said simply. She let out a shaky breath. "I'm trying." The strangest part of all of this was how at peace I felt. For years, I had held on to this deep, unspoken pain, carrying it around like a weight on my shoulders. But after that speech, after finally telling my truth, it was like I had set it down. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn my parents' love, but now I realized I didn't need it anymore. Danielle noticed the change in me too. "You're lighter," she said one night as we lay in bed. "Like you finally let go of something you didn't even know you were carrying." She was right. Emma and I weren't suddenly best friends. My mother and I weren't magically close. My father might never speak to me again, but that was okay, because for the first time in my life, I was living for myself, not for them. One night I received a text from an unknown number. "I saw the video of your speech. You have no idea how much it meant to me. You made me realize I need to stand up for myself too. Thank you." I had no idea who it was from, but I didn't need to. I had spent my whole life thinking I was alone in what I had gone through, but maybe, just maybe, there were others like me. People who had been overlooked, people who had been made to feel like they weren't enough. But we were enough. We always had been. And now, finally, I believed it. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of pain. Weeks turned into months, and though my relationship with my parents remained fragile, I found myself no longer holding on to resentment. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need them to acknowledge the hurt they had caused. What I needed was the peace that came with accepting things as they were and moving forward. Emma and I continued talking, slowly rebuilding a bond that had never truly existed before. She took a step back from our parents' world, found a job on her own, and for the first time, she was learning to stand on her own feet. It wasn't easy for her, but she was trying, and that meant something. One afternoon, I met my mother for coffee. She was quieter than usual, her usual air of superiority replaced with something else, something closer to humility. "I think about that speech a lot," she admitted. "I didn't realize how much I had failed you until I heard you say it out loud." I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. "Your father won't change," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "But I want to do better, if you'll let me." Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But for the first time in my life, she was offering me something real. "I think we both have a lot to learn," I said. She smiled, and for the first time, it felt genuine. I realized then that people don't always change in the ways we want them to. Sometimes, the best we can do is set our boundaries, protect our peace, and allow those who want to be in our lives to meet us halfway. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making my parents feel the way they had made me feel. It was about healing, about breaking cycles, about choosing to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past. Family is complicated. Love doesn't always come in the form we expect. And sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most don't know how. But we don't have to let that define us. We don't have to carry that weight forever. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever struggled to be seen, know that you are enough just as you are. Your worth isn't defined by your family, your past, or the way others have treated you. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family dynamic? How did you find healing? I'd love to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Because at the end of the day, we all deserve to be seen. We all deserve to be loved for who we are. And sometimes, the first step toward healing is simply knowing that we're not alone. So what about you? Share your opinion about this.